In Austin, Texas, 1998, Attackfortune bei der Hilltip-Mansion des Glaswalls, Lockett geht's, einer Live-Fotograf voor magazines. 10. On July 16, two namen stop ans Wearingphones. Tire car stay in the driveway. Wallets, laptops, and keys remain inside. The dog waits behind the closet door. Police walk room to room and find no forced entry, no broken glass, no note on the counter. Weeks pass, headliness out, and the house sits dark. Years later, in open desert north of the city, a shore hits metal an old box sealed on a hard soil.
The story begins with the city of Austin, Texas, in 1998, under the sweltering summer sun, a city that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of its unique blend of history, culture, and wealth. Austin was a place where the world of affluence and academia, music and politics collided, creating a lifestyle marked by both luxury and intellectual vibrance. Nestled among the rolling hills and oak trees, a sprawling mansion stood on the outskirts of the city, a symbol of the success and ambition of its owners, Margaret and Richard Adler. They had made their fortune in tech, an industry that was booming in the 1990s, and their wealth was enough to afford them a lifestyle that most could only dream of. Their home was a modern estate, a masterpiece of architectural design, with towering windows, a pool, gardens filled with rare flowers, and a view that overlooked the distant hills of the Texas countryside. From the outside, their life appeared perfect, a couple in their late 40s, childless by choice, with an enviable life of luxury and promise. Richard, a quiet and intense man with piercing blue eyes, was known in social circles for his work as a tech entrepreneur, someone whose companies were quietly changing the landscape of online businesses. Margaret, on the other hand, was warm and charismatic, a natural socialite who made everyone feel at ease. Together, they were the picture of success, moving smoothly in circles filled with other wealthy elites, mingling at charity galas and private dinners, their names frequently seen in the glossy pages of lifestyle magazines. Yet, beyond the surface of their glamorous public life, the couple was always intensely private. They had a tight circle of friends, but they were never ones to seek the limelight or share personal details. Despite their wealth and social status, there was an air of mystery that surrounded them, an enigma that many found intriguing but never quite deciphered. Then, on the evening of July 16th, 1998, they vanished without a trace. At first, it seemed like a misunderstanding. Richard had spoken to his business partner earlier that morning, confirming a meeting scheduled for the next day. Margaret had attended a lunch with a few close friends and was supposed to return home in the afternoon. Yet, when the evening came and neither of them had returned, their friends began to grow concerned. They reached out to the couple's neighbors, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. The mansion was undisturbed, the gates locked, and all the lights inside were off. It was as though they had simply disappeared into thin air. When the police arrived at the Adler estate, they found no signs of forced entry, no indication that a crime had been committed. The couple's belongings were all present. Wallets, phones, laptops. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Their cars were parked in the driveway, and the family dog was left inside, looking confused but unharmed. It was as if Margaret and Richard had simply decided to walk away from their lives, leaving behind everything that had defined them. But this didn't make sense. If they had chosen to disappear, why hadn't they taken anything with them? No one had any answers. The initial search was wide and exhaustive. The police combed through the house, the surrounding woods, and even the local area's remote parts, but there was no trace of the couple. The neighbors, friends, and employees at their tech companies were all questioned, but no one could offer a solid explanation. People started to speculate. Maybe they had run off together, leaving behind their lives for some reason, but nothing seemed to support this theory. There was no evidence of marital discord, no financial problems, and certainly no indication of foul play. As the days turned into weeks, the case only deepened in mystery. Margaret and Richard's families were devastated, but they held on to the hope that the couple had simply decided to start over. Perhaps they were somewhere far away, living under new identities. But deep down, they knew something was wrong. Margaret's parents couldn't believe that their daughter, who had always been so close to them, would ever leave without saying goodbye. Richard's brother, a former military officer, also found it impossible to believe that his brother would have left voluntarily. Despite the initial optimism, the investigation began to hit a wall. There were no ransom demands, no evidence of struggle, no indications of any sort of threat. The police tried to dig deeper into the couple's lives, hoping that some hidden aspect of their past would provide a clue, but each lead seemed to evaporate into the ether. The couple had no known enemies, no disgruntled business partners, and no close relatives who had any sort of animosity toward them. As weeks stretched into months, the initial media frenzy faded, and the case began to grow colder. The mystery of their disappearance became a topic of speculation among local residents, with many believing that the couple had staged their own vanishing. Some whispered that they had been involved in something shady. Perhaps the tech world was hiding darker secrets, or maybe they had been embroiled in something illegal. Others thought that Richard, a man known for his reclusive nature, had simply had enough of the high-profile life. But no one could say for sure. In the following months, the investigation grew quiet. A few leads came in, random tips from people claiming to have seen the couple in different parts of the country, but none of them proved to be credible. There was a theory that the couple had faked their deaths, possibly to escape a financial or personal crisis, but without any evidence to support it, the authorities were forced to let the case cool. Margaret and Richard Adler, once the epitome of success, became ghosts in the public consciousness, their mansion left in decay and their story fading from the headlines. But in the back of the minds of those who had known them, the question remained, what had truly happened? Had they simply vanished? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? As the years passed, their disappearance continued to haunt those closest to them. Family members never gave up hope, believing that one day the truth would come to light. They could never quite let go of the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, that the couple hadn't disappeared willingly, and that they were somewhere out there, waiting to be found. In the end, the mansion was sold, and life in Austin continued. But the eerie silence that surrounded the missing couple was always there, lingering in the background, haunting the city in a way that no one could escape. The mystery of the Adlers' disappearance was a part of Austin's history now, a cold case that would never quite fade away. And yet, for all the years that passed, no one could have predicted that the truth was about to be uncovered. Hidden for nearly 3 decades, waiting in a desert cache, buried and forgotten. The disappearance of Richard and Margaret Adler sent shockwaves through Austin, and as the days turned into weeks with no sign of the couple, the initial fervor surrounding the case began to subside, replaced by confusion and mounting frustration. At first, the public was captivated by the mystery, as the media painted their lives as the epitome of wealth and success. 2 individuals who had seemingly vanished without a trace from a life most would envy. But as the search efforts proved fruitless, the case began to fade from headlines, and the authorities faced the daunting task of sifting through a growing pool of theories and dead-end leads. The investigation, in the early stages, was marked by a sense of disbelief. In the immediate aftermath of their disappearance, the police had done what they could to locate the missing couple, but there were no obvious answers. The mansion remained untouched, as though they had simply walked out the door one evening and never returned. The family's friends, employees, and acquaintances were all interviewed, hoping to shed light on anything unusual in the weeks leading up to the vanishing. Yet, as each person came forward, it became increasingly clear that no one could offer any substantial insights into the couple's possible motivations. They had appeared to be living the American dream, a wealthy, professional couple with everything going for them. No one had noticed anything amiss. No one had heard any unusual conversations or witnessed any altercations. The first crack in the facade came from a deep dive into the couple's personal and financial history. The couple's impeccable public image, cultivated through years of careful social maneuvering and success, began to show signs of fracture when investigators took a closer look. Richard and Margaret had no children, something that had always intrigued friends and acquaintances. The couple's decision not to have kids had never been openly discussed, but those who knew them speculated about their reasons. Some thought it was simply a lifestyle choice, a decision born of their devotion to their careers and the luxuries of their lives. Others whispered that there had been fertility issues or perhaps a deeper, unspoken rift between them, one that had been kept from public view. Investigators learned that, despite their outward wealth and privilege, there had been hints of financial strain in recent months. Richard's tech empire, once a booming success, had begun to feel the pressures of the changing market, with stock prices falling and some of his projects stalling. Margaret, too, had recently been involved in a series of investments that had not yielded the returns they had hoped for. But this wasn't the full picture. Despite these financial challenges, the couple's wealth had not been seriously impacted, and their lifestyle had not changed dramatically. They had still been living in their mansion, driving expensive cars, and attending the finest social events. The disparity between their public image and private reality began to raise questions among those investigating the case. Was the couple's perfect life just a carefully constructed illusion, or was there something deeper, more personal, that had driven them to take drastic, inexplicable action? The investigators began to turn their attention toward the people in the Adler circle. Interviews with friends revealed something unsettling, a palpable sense of tension when they spoke about Richard and Margaret. No one could put their finger on it exactly, but there were whispers of strained relationships, particularly with certain business associates and family members. Richard's brother, who had once been close to him, was notably absent from the investigation. A former military officer, he had not offered much information about his brother's disappearance, and when he did speak to investigators, his answers were vague, as though he were holding something back. Margaret's family, on the other hand, was more vocal in their concern, though they too had no answers to provide. Margaret's mother, in particular, had trouble reconciling the idea that her daughter could simply disappear of her own volition. She described Margaret as the more pragmatic of the two, hardly the type to walk away from everything she had built without a word. Friends and colleagues began to wonder if there had been some kind of pressure, either financial or emotional, that had pushed the couple to take this drastic step. Some speculated that Richard, perhaps burdened by the collapse of his tech empire, had orchestrated the disappearance as a way to escape his mounting responsibilities. Others believed that Margaret, more of a social butterfly, had been the true driving force behind their disappearance, either out of desire for a fresh start or as a response to some deep personal crisis. But no one could say for sure. And as more time passed, the lines between reality and speculation began to blur. The couple's apparent wealth, combined with the eerily quiet nature of their disappearance, led some to entertain the idea that they had staged the entire thing. A theory emerged that they had fabricated their own deaths, planned to flee, and had hidden away their most valuable assets in secret locations. It was whispered that Margaret had once expressed a longing for freedom, a desire to escape the constant pressure of public life and live anonymously. Richard, too, had been known to speak about the stress of the tech world and the constant need to be ahead of the competition. Could they have planned to leave everything behind, including their mansion, their businesses, and their social standing? The idea of a planned escape began to gain traction. But even if they had disappeared on their own accord, the question remained: why? What had driven them to abandon everything so suddenly? The answers were elusive, and the investigation into their personal lives only deepened the mystery. There were hints of relationships that had become strained, businesses that had failed, and even rumors of an affair involving Margaret, though nothing concrete ever came of these whispers. As the investigation into the disappearance of Richard and Margaret Adler continued, what had once seemed like an open-end shut case of a couple slipping away into the unknown began to take on a far more disturbing and enigmatic tone. The initial idea that they had voluntarily disappeared to escape their lives grew increasingly unlikely as investigators dug deeper into the couple's past. What had initially appeared to be a picture-perfect marriage was, in fact, more layered and troubled than anyone could have anticipated. The truth, it seemed, was hidden beneath the surface of meticulously constructed life, and every lead seemed to take investigators further into a labyrinth of secrets, lies, and unspoken grievances. The couple's seemingly idyllic existence was not as simple as it appeared. Margaret and Richard had always been viewed as the epitome of success, a power couple in the truest sense. They had no children, which in itself raised some eyebrows, especially among those who knew them best. Their decision not to have a family was always a touchy subject, often avoided in conversation, but there was a sense of mystery surrounding it. Was it a conscious decision? Or was there something deeper, more personal at play? Some speculated that Richard, a man who had always been intensely focused on his career, simply didn't have the time or inclination to raise children. Others whispered that Margaret had experienced a traumatic miscarriage early in their marriage, an event that had left her deeply scarred and emotionally distant from the idea of motherhood. But no one knew for sure. As the investigation continued, it became clear that there were emotional undercurrents between the couple that no one had ever picked up on. Richard, though outwardly successful and respected in his field, was not a man easily understood. He had a quiet, reserved nature that made it difficult for others to get close to him, even those who worked with him daily. Colleagues described him as a brilliant but aloof visionary, a man whose mind was always several steps ahead of the industry. But this same intensity that made him successful also left him isolated, unable or unwilling to connect on a deeper level with those around him. It wasn't uncommon for him to retreat into long periods of solitude, locking himself away in his study or disappearing for days on business trips with little communication to anyone. Those who tried to approach him about his personal life were met with polite but firm resistance. He was a man who kept his cards close to his chest. Margaret, by contrast, was outgoing, charismatic, and well-connected. She had a wide circle of friends, many of whom were part of Austin's elite social scene. She was a master at blending in, effortlessly attending galas, charity events, and private dinners, always the life of the party, always smiling. But beneath her polished exterior, there were signs of unrest. Friends describe her as having a deep sensitivity, an emotional complexity that she carefully masked with her public persona. Her socialite nature had always been at odds with her husband's more introverted, cerebral existence. At times, it seemed that the two were worlds apart emotionally. Margaret had a need for affection, for attention, for validation that Richard, in his quiet and absorbed way, could not always provide. And yet, outwardly, their marriage had appeared perfect. They complemented each other, in many ways, in the eyes of those who knew them. But to those closest to the couple, particularly Margaret's best friends and Richard's business associates, the cracks were starting to show. They started noticing subtle shifts in the couple's behavior long before their disappearance. Margaret seemed to be increasingly restless, often expressing a desire for something more from life. She was seen at various social gatherings, alone, in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, something that was unusual for someone so often accompanied by her husband. There were whispers that she had grown tired of her marriage, that she felt stifled by the demands of Richard's career and the pressures of maintaining the perfect public image. Richard, too, had begun to show signs of stress in the months leading up to their vanishing. Friends who had known him for years commented on how withdrawn he had become, spending more and more time in his home office and less time in the company of his wife or colleagues. His work, once his passion, seemed to be weighing heavily on him. There were discussions of possible financial troubles within his tech empire, projects that had stalled, deals that had fallen through, stock prices that were dipping. He had always been a perfectionist, but now, it seemed, the weight of the world was pressing on him. Some of his closest friends began to speculate that Richard was trying to outrun something, though no one could say exactly what. Despite these subtle signs of unrest, however, nothing could have prepared anyone for the revelation that would later emerge, that the Adler's financial troubles were far more severe than anyone had known. Through a combination of careful investigation and piecing together records from various sources, it became clear that the couple had accumulated significant debt in recent years, much of it tied to bad investments and failed business ventures. Richard had been desperate to keep the facade of success intact, pouring more and more of their wealth into new ventures, hoping to recoup what had been lost. But instead, their financial situation had worsened, and now, months later, their sudden disappearance began to make more sense. Had they disappeared to escape these mounting pressures? Was it possible that they had staged their vanishing, deciding to leave behind their lives, their mansion, and their obligations? The investigation delved into the couple's business dealings, uncovering more secrets that painted a picture of a life far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Margaret, too, had invested heavily in some risky ventures, many of which had not paid off. There were whispers of a failing business partnership, one that had gone sour just months before their disappearance, but no one could confirm the details. As the investigation into Richard and Margaret Adler's disappearance continued to unfold, new lines of inquiry were explored, revealing more about the enigmatic couple and the shadowy figures who had crossed paths with them. Initially, the search had focused on immediate family and close associates, but the deeper investigators probed, the more they uncovered a tangled web of relationships and connections, relationships that raised more questions than answers. The idea that the couple's vanishing had been a voluntary act, perhaps an escape from mounting pressures, started to lose traction. Instead, the narrative shifted toward more sinister possibilities, and soon, investigators found themselves questioning not only the motives of those closest to the couple, but also the nature of the relationships themselves. Were there people involved in their lives who might have had something to gain from their disappearance? Were there individuals whose dark motives had remained hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly peaceful existence? The first suspect to emerge was someone close to Richard, his longtime business partner, Thomas McAllister. McAllister was a man who had been integral to the success of Richard's tech empire, a man who had worked alongside him for over a decade. On the surface, McAllister seemed to be a loyal, trusted partner, the kind of person who would never betray his friend. But as investigators dug into McAllister's past, they uncovered a series of troubling discrepancies. Though his business acumen had been crucial to the growth of Richard's companies, there were whispers that McAllister had been involved in shady financial dealings behind Richard's back. Some employees within the company had raised concerns about McAllister's management of certain accounts, while others pointed to instances where he had made decisions without consulting Richard. It seemed that McAllister had always been the type of person who thrived on secrecy, making unilateral decisions and keeping information to himself. Rumors began to swirl that McAllister had been in a silent power struggle with Richard for some time. Despite their outwardly professional partnership, some suggested that McAllister had been quietly maneuvering to take control of Richard's business empire, positioning himself as a true visionary behind their success. Could McAllister have seen Richard's disappearance as a way to seize control of everything they had built together? The theory gained some traction, especially as investigators uncovered evidence that McAllister had been dealing with personal financial problems of his own. He had been caught up in a series of high-risk investments, many of which had failed, and he was reportedly in significant debt. Could his involvement in the Adler's disappearance be motivated by greed, an attempt to either eliminate a rival or take advantage of a sudden opportunity? As investigators dug deeper into McAllister's background, they found a growing number of people who spoke of his increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the couple's disappearance. A former employee at one of McAllister's other companies described how McAllister had begun to act paranoid, cutting himself off from his colleagues and becoming hostile when questioned about his business dealings. There were also reports of McAllister having unusual meetings with individuals whose backgrounds were murky at best, business contacts from foreign markets with questionable reputations. These were people who had no clear connection to the Adler's world, but had suddenly become entwined in McAllister's personal and professional life. The authorities couldn't ignore the possibility that McAllister's connections had extended far beyond what was initially thought, and that perhaps, in his desperation, he had entangled the Adlers in something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. But McAllister wasn't the only person with a potential motive. As the investigation expanded, the focus also shifted to Margaret's personal life. While Richard had been the more withdrawn, business-driven half of the couple, Margaret had been known for her social connections and outgoing nature. She had a vast network of friends, many of whom were part of Austin's upper echelons. But there were also individuals in her life who had far more questionable reputations. One name that kept coming up in the investigation was Nathaniel Gray, a man with a criminal background, once a childhood acquaintance of Margaret's before he had fallen out of her circle. Gray had a history of financial instability and had been known to associate with people involved in the underground economy, though his connections were mostly speculative. Though Gray had not been seen or heard from in years, there were rumors that he had resurfaced around the time of the Adler's disappearance. According to a few people who had known him years earlier, he had reached out to Margaret in the months before she and Richard vanished. What exactly their relationship had been during this period remained unclear, but the idea that Nathaniel Gray had rekindled some sort of personal or financial bond with Margaret was too significant to overlook. His criminal connections, coupled with his reappearance just before the Adlers vanished, raised suspicions that perhaps he had been involved in some way. Some believed that Margaret might have been lured back into his orbit by promises of financial help, or, more ominously, that he might have used his past influence over her to coerce her into a scheme. Gray's shadowy past, combined with his reemergence during the period leading up to the Adler's disappearance, led investigators to question whether he had played a part in the couple's vanishing. His ability to manipulate people, combined with his connections to criminal enterprises, made him a prime suspect in the case. But there was a troubling lack of evidence connecting him directly to the Adlers or their estate, and as of yet, no one had been able to provide proof that Margaret had been in contact with him during the critical period when the couple disappeared. In the months that followed Richard and Margaret Adler's disappearance, the investigation seemed to grind to a halt. Despite the growing pool of suspects, no substantial breakthroughs were made. The leads that came in, while intriguing, ultimately amounted to little more than dead ends. As investigators sifted through the growing stack of theories and personal accounts, they began to realize that there was a profound gap between the evidence available and the truth they sought. The lack of a concrete motive, the absence of witnesses, and the eerie tranquility of the couple's abandoned mansion created a strange paradox. The more they looked, the less they seemed to find. And yet, in that quiet desperation, a clue surfaced, seemingly inconsequential at first, but over time, it would prove to be the spark that reignited the case. It came in the form of a small item discovered in a storage unit belonging to the Adlers. The unit, rented under Richard's name, had been left untouched in the months after their disappearance, as investigators focused their efforts on the mansion and the couple's immediate surroundings. It wasn't until a routine check of their financial records led authorities to the forgotten storage space that it was brought to light. When they opened the unit, they found little of real importance. A few old family heirlooms, boxes of forgotten paperwork, and some odd trinkets that didn't seem to fit the couple's usual tastes. But amid these mundane objects was something peculiar, an old weathered leather journal. Its pages yellow with age, its edges frayed. The journal, though seemingly insignificant, carried with it a sense of mystery that made investigators pause. It was not a diary in the traditional sense, but rather a collection of notes, scribblings, and fragmented thoughts, many of which appeared to be written by Richard himself. At first glance, the journal seemed like little more than a private record of business transactions and personal musings, but as investigators spent more time examining its contents, they began to realize that it offered a glimpse into a mind unraveling under pressure. The journal entries were erratic, sometimes barely legible, and reflected a growing sense of paranoia and anxiety. Richard wrote about his financial troubles, the mounting pressure from investors, and the increasing distance between himself and Margaret. But there was more, hidden between the lines. There were cryptic references to individuals who seemed to be connected to the shadowy undercurrents of his business dealings. Some names were familiar, people who had been mentioned during the initial investigation, but others were entirely new. These unfamiliar names, coupled with Richard's increasingly fractured thoughts, suggested that he had become embroiled in something far more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. He wrote about people threatening him, about feeling as though he were being watched, and about his growing fear that something terrible was about to happen. There was a recurring theme of escape. Richard seemed obsessed with the idea of fleeing, of leaving everything behind. It was as if he were trying to plan an exit strategy, but without the clarity or certainty that comes with making such a decision. As the journal was scrutinized further, the investigators found references to something more disturbing, a cache of items, buried somewhere in the desert, that Richard had planned to use as a last resort. These items, which were never fully explained in the journal, were mentioned in passing, as if Richard had expected to leave clues for someone to find. There were no detailed maps or instructions, just vague allusions to the cache being a safe place where he could hide away in case things went wrong. The journal didn't explain what the things were that Richard feared, nor did it make clear what exactly had gone wrong in his life. It was as though Richard had begun to see his own life unraveling in real time, unable to keep up with the demands of his business, his marriage, or the dark forces that seemed to be closing in on him from all sides. This discovery breathed new life into the investigation, but it also complicated it further. Was the cache mentioned in the journal a literal stash, or was a metaphor for something more abstract, a final act of desperation, a last-ditch attempt to escape the inescapable? If it was real, where was it, and what did it contain? The idea of a hidden cache buried somewhere in the vast desert of Texas sent shockwaves to the team, but it also brought with it a sense of urgency. Richard had been secretive and elusive in life, and now it seemed that even in his last moments, he had gone to great lengths to conceal something important enough to be buried, forgotten, and left for someone else to find. But what could it be, and why had he gone to such lengths to hide it? The lead seemed promising, but it was also fraught with difficulty. The desert surrounding Austin was vast, and any search for the cache would have to be meticulous and exhaustive. Authorities enlisted the help of search teams, trained dogs, and even aerial drones to comb to the barren landscape in search of any trace of the missing items. Weeks turned into months, and the search proved to be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. There were no immediate breakthroughs, and the desert remained stubbornly silent. The only clues that surfaced were fragments of objects, indistinct and weathered, that seemed to have little connection to the Adlers or their disappearance. Still, the search continued, fueled by the belief that the cache contained something significant, something that would finally explain the mystery of the Adlers' vanishing. Meanwhile, back in Austin, the investigation into the couple's immediate family and business associates continued. As more of Richard's private thoughts and fears were revealed through his journal, investigators began to question whether he had been dealing with more than just financial stress or marital problems. The cryptic references to threats against him and his growing paranoia suggested that he had been in contact with individuals who may have had ulterior motives. But who were these people? What did they want from him? The authorities started to investigate Richard's business dealings in greater detail, particularly those involving foreign investors and shady transactions that had been made in the months leading up to his disappearance. There were rumors of blackmail, secretive deals, and hostile takeovers, all of which pointed toward a possibility that Richard had become entangled in a web of corporate espionage or even criminal activity. The more investigators uncovered, the more it seemed that Richard and Margaret had been living under the shadow of something much darker than anyone had realized. Was it possible that their disappearance was a result of something far more sinister than a voluntary escape from financial ruin? Had Richard's obsession with hiding away in the desert cache been driven by more than just the fear of losing his wealth or his marriage? It seemed that the couple's life was far more complex and dangerous than anyone could have imagined, and every new piece of evidence only seemed to add layers to the mystery. As the search for the cache continued, the investigators also began to wonder whether they would ever uncover the full truth of what had happened to Richard and Margaret. Would the cache hold the key to their disappearance, or would it merely raise more questions? And even if they did find it, what would they discover hidden in the desert? An answer or another riddle to unravel? The journey to uncover the truth had become as elusive and fragmented as the couple's final days, leaving everyone involved to wrestle with the haunting reality that they might never fully understand why Richard and Margaret Adler disappeared, or what they had left behind. As months turned into years, the mystery of Richard and Margaret Adler's disappearance became one of those rare, unsolved cases that linger in the public consciousness like a slow-burning ember, never fully extinguishing. The media, which had once been consumed with the couple's story, slowly moved on to newer headlines, leaving the Adler's case to fade into the shadows. But for those who had been closest to the couple, the case remained an open wound, one that refused to heal. Friends, family, and former colleagues clung to the hope that one day the truth would surface, that someone would uncover the mystery, unravel the final pieces of the puzzle, and provide closure to what had, for so long, remained inexplicably unresolved. The police, too, had not given up. While they had exhausted many of their leads, there were still too many unanswered questions. Had Richard and Margaret truly vanished of their own volition, as some had suggested, driven by the stress of their personal and financial troubles? Or was there something far darker at play, a hidden conspiracy, a betrayal, or a crime that had been carefully orchestrated? The authorities, while working on a case with little to go on, continued to follow any potential lead, even those that seemed trivial or remote. But over time, as more years passed, it became apparent that the key to unlocking the mystery lay not in the city of Austin, where the couple had lived, but far beyond the familiar landscape of their home. It lay in a place of desolation, in the vast stretches of desert outside of the city, an unforgiving and silent landscape where secrets, like forgotten relics, could be buried away, hidden from the eyes of the world. It was in 2005, nearly 7 years after the Adler's disappearance, that a breakthrough finally emerged, but it came in the most unexpected of ways. A local prospector, working in the remote desert north of Austin, stumbled upon something peculiar while searching for minerals. As he sifted through the loose soil, hoping to find something valuable, his shovel struck something solid. It was a metal box, old and rusted, buried deep in the earth. The prospector, intrigued by the discovery, unearthed the box and opened it to reveal a collection of documents photographs, and a series of carefully wrapped objects. It wasn't just an ordinary collection of forgotten relics. It was, without a doubt, something more significant. A trove of items that appeared to have been carefully hidden away, waiting to be found. Among the contents were business papers that belonged to Richard, contracts that had been signed in the months leading up to his disappearance, and most unsettling of all, a series of photographs of Richard and Margaret, taken in various locations over the years. The images seemed innocuous at first, but as investigators began to analyze them, it became clear that some of the photos had been taken at strange, seemingly random locations, places that had no apparent significance to the couple's life in Austin, but which were now marked by a sense of foreboding. What stood out most to the investigators were the series of photographs of the couple in a remote desert setting, not far from where the prospector had made his find. They were taken the months just before their disappearance, and in each photo, Richard and Margaret appeared to be in a state of unease, as if they were being watched. There was something in their expressions that suggested they were aware of a danger lurking just beyond the frame, but they had not yet fully grasped the extent of the threat. The photos were haunting in their ambiguity, hinting at a fear that had not yet fully manifested, but which was simmering beneath the surface. As the photographs were examined, investigators began to piece together a theory. The Adlers had not disappeared to escape their lives. They had vanished because they had become entangled in something far more dangerous. The cache, it seemed, had been a part of a larger plan, one that involved a hidden trail of clues leading towards something dark and sinister, something that was buried in the desert, just waiting to be uncovered. With this new evidence in hand, the authorities returned to the desert area, where the prospector had found the box. They began to comb through the surrounding land with renewed determination, their efforts now focused on retracing the steps of Richard and Margaret. For months, they scoured the area, using ground-penetrating radar, drones, and other technology to search for any further signs of the Adlers' presence. The vast emptiness of the desert seemed to mock their efforts, but they pressed on, guided by the belief that they were on the brink of uncovering something monumental. Finally, after weeks of searching, they found what they were looking for, a second cache buried even deeper than the first. This cache, though not as large as the first, contained items of even greater significance. Richard's personal journals, scribbled notes, and a collection of rare, encrypted documents that had been hidden for years. As investigators carefully examined these materials, they uncovered a web of financial transactions, secret meetings, and clandestine business dealings that had gone unnoticed by everyone, including the authorities. Years passed, and the mystery of Richard and Margaret Adler's disappearance slowly shifted from a fresh headline to a cold case, a haunting puzzle left unresolved. The discovery of the hidden caches had reignited the investigation, but the pieces remained frustratingly elusive. Despite the newfound evidence, the authorities had yet to unearth the identity of the shadowy figure behind Richard's cryptic letters or uncover the full extent of conspiracy that appeared to have been woven into their lives. The search for X seemed to stall, with each lead proving to be another tangled thread that led nowhere. As investigators continued to follow the twisted path of Richard's business dealings and personal relationships, they found themselves confronting an increasingly complex web of deceit, betrayal, and hidden alliances. And yet, despite the growing evidence of a larger scheme, one that pointed toward powerful figures beyond the Adlers' immediate circle, the full picture remained shrouded in darkness. The breakthroughs had been tantalizing but incomplete. The letters from Richard had been the most substantial clue, hinting at someone, perhaps a former business partner or a disgruntled associate, who had orchestrated their disappearance. X remained a mystery, an enigmatic figure who loomed over the case like an invisible hand, pulling the strings of Richard's unraveling life. The authorities had tracked down a few leads, but each one turned out to be either inconclusive or deceptive. The lack of concrete evidence regarding who X was and their role in the Adlers' disappearance was maddening. But, as with many complex investigations, sometimes the answers arrive in the most unexpected places. In 2012, nearly 15 years after Richard and Margaret had vanished, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an anonymous tipster. The tip was vague, almost cryptic in its delivery, but it pointed toward a connection between the Adlers' disappearance and a series of shady transactions in the world of international finance. The tip suggested that Richard and Margaret had unknowingly crossed paths with a notorious group of money launderers, people with connections in the world of high-stakes finance and underworld dealings. This group, the tip claimed, had been using Richard's business ventures to funnel money through legitimate companies, and when Richard had grown suspicious and started pulling back, they had decided to eliminate him, along with his wife. The authorities followed the lead, and what they uncovered was chilling. Richard's tech company, it turned out, had been unknowingly embroiled in a global money laundering operation. Through a series of shell companies and complex financial transactions, vast sums of money had been funneled through Richard's firm without his knowledge. The company had unwittingly become a conduit for money from criminal enterprises, and once Richard had begun to ask too many questions, he had become a liability. It was starting to look as though his decision to confront those behind the illegal dealings had cost him dearly. Whoever had orchestrated the scheme needed him gone, and it seemed that Margaret, too, had been swept into the maelstrom of danger simply because she was too close to the truth. The investigation revealed a tangled network of financial institutions, shadowy figures from overseas, and illicit dealings that spanned continents. The more the authorities dug into the financial records, the more they realized that Richard and Margaret had unwittingly become part of a much larger scheme, one that had been in motion long before they ever suspected anything was wrong. This discovery, however, only raised more questions. How had Richard and Margaret been lured into this world? Had they known what was going on, or had they been completely unaware of the scale of the operation? And, most importantly, who was behind it all? The name X had resurfaced once again, this time attached to a group of financiers with connections to the world of organized crime. Investigators traced the money trail, discovering that it led back to a small, powerful circle of individuals who operated just beneath the surface of the legitimate financial world. They were not the typical criminal masterminds. They were highly skilled businessmen and women, people who blended into high society, operating in the shadows. These were the people who had made it their business to ensure that Richard and Margaret's company was the perfect cover for their operations. But as investigators unearthed more about these powerful figures, they realized that X was not a single person at all. It was an alias, a name used by a collective group who operated with ruthless precision. This group had hands in numerous ventures, money laundering, illegal arms deals, and even human trafficking, and Richard and Margaret's inadvertent involvement had made them a prime target. The realization was both chilling and tragic. The Adler's disappearance had not been some random act of violence, but the result of a larger, orchestrated plan designed to protect the interests of a dangerous, unseen enemy. In the midst of this discovery, a new angle to the case emerged, one that brought with it a sense of eerie finality. A breakthrough came in the form of a person who had been marginally connected to the case from the very beginning, a former employee of Richard's company, a woman named Elena Torres. Elena had been a quiet, unassuming presence in the office, but she had always been curious about the strange transactions and the growing tension that seemed to surround her boss. In the weeks leading up to Richard and Margaret's disappearance, Elena had noticed a shift in his behavior. He had become distant, withdrawn, and increasingly paranoid, often locking himself away in his office for hours at a time. She had overheard snippets of conversations about secret meetings and mysterious figures, but she had never given them much thought. That was until one fateful day when she overheard something that sent a chill down her spine. Elena had been walking through the halls of the office when she overheard Richard speaking urgently to someone on the phone. As the years stretched on, the investigation into the disappearance of Richard and Margaret Adler seemed to take on a rhythm of its own, its forward momentum checked by bureaucratic red tape, limited resources, and the cold, unyielding passage of time. The discovery of the caches and the cryptic letter had led the investigation down a new, darker path, one fraught with intrigue and deepening danger. Despite the breakthroughs in identifying the shadowy figures involved in the money laundering operation, the true identity of X remained elusive. Every step forward seemed to reveal new layers of conspiracy, but also open up even more questions. The case, which had once seemed like an isolated mystery, was now tied to a vast web of criminal activity and corruption that spanned the globe. In the midst of all this, one of the most chilling aspects of the case was the ongoing mystery of the Adler's final days. While the authorities had uncovered financial misdeeds and had even managed to trace the money laundering scheme to certain key individuals, The question of how Richard and Margaret had ended up in the desert and why remained unanswered. The photograph from the cache had shown them at various locations in the desert, looking uneasy and out of place, but nothing in their personal lives suggested that they had ever intended to run away, nor did it seem likely that they had made a conscious choice to disappear. As the investigation progressed, it became more apparent that something had driven them to the desert, a force greater than simple financial distress or the strains of their marriage. It was as if they had been caught in the middle of something far more dangerous, something far outside their control, one of the most intriguing and ultimately haunting. Pieces of evidence that emerged during this time was a small, nearly illegible note found among Richard's belongings in the second cache. The note, written hastily on a torn piece of notebook paper, was a plea for help. It was addressed to no one in particular, but seemed to be a desperate message for someone, anyone, who might find it. The note read, "If you find this, please understand, this isn't us. We didn't have a choice." The words were broken and scattered, as if Richard had been writing in a panic, trying to convey something urgent and important before he was interrupted or forced to stop. The note gave the investigators their first real glimpse into the Adler's state of mind in the final days before their disappearance. It was clear from the message that Richard had not left voluntarily. He had been driven to an unknown place by forces beyond his control. But who had forced them, and what exactly had happened in those last moments, remained a question without an answer. The note left behind a chilling feeling of inevitability. The Adlers had been caught in a spiral of escalating threats and dangers, and it was evident that they had been trying to escape. But escape from what? And more importantly, why had they ended up in the desert, so far from their home, so isolated and vulnerable? The question gnawed at the investigators. As the investigation unfolded, the sense that something terrible was closing in on the Adlers in those final moments became stronger, yet more elusive. The deeper the authorities dug into the complex web of financial dealings, the more they realized that the couple had been unwitting pawns in a far more intricate and dangerous game. The money laundering operation was one aspect of it, but there were also whispers of organized crime, political ties, and international corruption that pointed to a network much larger and more insidious than anyone had imagined. A breakthrough came when a former business associate of Richard's, a man named Victor Lyle, came forward with new information. Lyle had been one of the key people involved in the early days of Richard's company, but had severed ties with him years before the disappearance. Lyle had been on the periphery of Richard's life, only vaguely aware of the troubles his former friend had been facing, but after hearing about the investigation, he had been struck by something that didn't sit right with him. He remembered a meeting from several years earlier, one that had slipped his mind until the details resurfaced in his mind years later. Richard had reached out to Lyle for advice on a potential business deal, something involving international financing and offshore accounts. At the time, Lyle had thought little of it, brushing off Richard's concerns as simply part of the growing pains of the business. But now, reflecting on the conversation, Lyle realized that there had been something more sinister at play. Richard had been nervous, not about the deal itself, but about the people involved. He had been worried about the international figures he had been meeting with, some of whom Lyle recognized from the fringes of organized crime. Richard had never been one to speak openly about danger, but he confided in Lyle that he felt trapped, like there was no way out. Lyle's recollection of that meeting gave the investigation a new direction. The case of Richard and Margaret Adler had always been one of those mysteries that stayed with people long after the headlines faded. In the years following their disappearance, the truth seemed to slip further into obscurity. Investigators, while diligent, have been confronted with an overwhelming amount of false leads, dead ends, and a sense that something larger was at play. The years wore on, and with each passing moment, the memory of the Adlers' lives seemed to fade just a little more, overshadowed by time's relentless march and the overwhelming complexity of the case. But even as the world moved on, there remained those few who still held on to belief that somewhere, deep in the desert or hidden within the sprawling financial labyrinth that had ensnared the Adlers, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. It was in 2017, nearly 2 decades after Richard and Margaret's disappearance, that an unexpected development breathed new life into the investigation. A man named Derek Holloway, a private investigator with a reputation for working on high-profile cold cases, had stumbled across a piece of evidence that no one else had thought to look for. Derek was known for his dogged determination and unorthodox methods, and when he first took on the case of the Adlers, many believed it was just another high-profile case for him to add to his portfolio. But Derek wasn't interested in the spotlight or the fame. He was interested in the truth. His interest in the Adlers was piqued by the stories he'd heard about the case and the growing sense that there were still too many questions left unanswered. He wanted to know what had really happened to them, and he wasn't willing to let the case gather dust like so many others. Derek's breakthrough came when he uncovered an overlooked financial document from one of Richard's earlier ventures, a transaction from a company that had not been thoroughly investigated in previous years. The document, which had been buried deep in the financial archives, contained a series of strange transactions between Richard's company and a foreign financial institution. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a routine business deal. But as Derek dug deeper into the details, he realized that the money being funneled into Richard's account was tied to a series of offshore accounts linked to an enigmatic network of individuals. These were not the same individuals associated with the money laundering scheme that had come to light earlier in the investigation. These new names were connected to another layer of criminal activity, one far more clandestine, involving covert political maneuverings, high-stakes international trade, and some of the most powerful figures in the world of organized crime. The discovery sent ripples through the investigation, and Derek's interest in the case deepened. He believed that the Adler's disappearance had not been a random event, nor was it solely the result of a money laundering operation gone wrong. There were deeper, more complex forces at play, forces that had led the Adlers down a path they had never anticipated. Derek theorized that Richard and Margaret had somehow become embroiled in a secretive world of international power struggles, one in which their wealth and status had been exploited by figures far more dangerous than anyone had suspected. As Derek continued to track the paper trail, he stumbled upon a connection that sent a chill down his spine, a link between Richard's financial dealings and a shadowy private contractor named Lucien Darnell. Darnell was a man whose name had never appeared in the case before, but whose reputation in the underground world was well known. He was rumored to have ties to powerful political figures, arms dealers, and organized crime syndicates, a man who moved in the shadows of the most high-stakes international deals. Darnell was not a man to be crossed, and the mere mention of his name in connection with Richard Adler's business dealings was enough to raise alarms. Derek's breakthrough raised an even more chilling possibility. What if the Adlers had not simply stumbled into a dangerous web of financial corruption and criminal activity, but had actually been targeted for their wealth and influence? What if their involvement had not been accidental, but orchestrated by powerful players who had manipulated Richard's business ventures from the very beginning? Derek suspected that Richard and Margaret's disappearance was not a case of them running away or falling victim to a botched crime, but rather the result of a cold, calculated plan to eliminate them, possibly prevent them from exposing dangerous truths or to remove them as obstacles in a larger game of global power. The more Derek uncovered, the clearer it became that Richard and Margaret's lives had been carefully orchestrated and controlled by those with far-reaching influence. The couple had been surrounded by people they trusted, people would use that trust to draw them deeper into a web of lies, deceit, and criminal enterprise. The couple had believed they were simply growing a business, building an empire, but the reality was that they had become pawns in a much larger game, one that they had no control over, and one that ultimately cost them their lives. The evidence pointed to a conspiracy that reached far beyond the Adlers' immediate circle. Derek uncovered proof that Richard had been aware of the danger surrounding him in the final months of his life. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, Richard had received multiple anonymous warnings, each more urgent than the last. One particularly chilling note, found among his personal papers, read, "You've crossed a line, Richard. Leave it alone, or your family will pay the price." It was clear that Richard had tried to extricate himself from the situation, but the deeper he dug, the more dangerous the consequences became. The note, along with the documents Derek had uncovered, painted a picture of a man caught in a trap, one that he had not been able to escape. As Derek continued to piece together the threads of the case, he realized that the disappearance of Richard and Margaret Adler was only one part of a much larger puzzle. The conspiracy behind their deaths was part of a web of corruption and crime that spanned multiple continents, involving not just the individuals who had been directly linked to Richard's business dealings, but also a network of political elites, military contractors, and organized crime syndicates. The deeper Derek dug, the more apparent became that Richard and Margaret had become entangled in something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The question that remained, however, was whether the authorities would ever be able to bring those responsible to justice. The people involved in the conspiracy were powerful, connected, and ruthless. They had the resources to cover their tracks, and Derek knew that the odds of them ever being brought to account were slim. But he couldn't let go. He couldn't accept the idea that Richard and Margaret had been taken from the world so violently. Their lives erased in a way that no one would ever understand. Derek's investigation, while uncovering new layers of the truth, also led to a dark realization. Some truths are too dangerous to uncover. The deeper he delved into the conspiracy, the more he found himself at odds with powerful forces. His every move seemed to be watched, his every conversation potentially compromised. He had been warned by colleagues in the law enforcement community to tread carefully, to avoid pushing too hard into certain areas. The people behind conspiracy had eyes everywhere, and Derek knew that if he wasn't careful, he might become the next target. In the end, Derek Holloway's work on the case did not bring the immediate resolution that many had hoped for. The Adler story remained an open wound, the truth still buried beneath a mountain of secrets, lies, and corruption. What he did uncover, however, was something much darker and more pervasive, a world of shadowy figures and covert dealings that stretched far beyond the case of a single couple. Richard and Margaret Adler had been victims, yes, but they were also part of something much larger, something that few would ever understand. Their lives had been taken as part of a game of power, and their deaths were the result of forces that no one had truly understood, until it was too late. The case of Richard and Margaret Adler's disappearance had, in the end, become more than just a story of a couple lost in the desert. It had become a tale of conspiracy, greed, and the terrifying lengths to which the powerful would go to protect their secrets. And while the truth had been uncovered in part, it was still elusive, like a shadow in the distance, always just beyond reach, always just out of sight. The investigation into Richard and Margaret Adler's disappearance had become a story of its own, a complex, multifaceted tale that intertwined the personal, the financial, and the criminal. As the years passed and more evidence surfaced, the case became less about finding the couple and more about understanding how their lives had become so deeply enmeshed in a world of shadows, where power, wealth, and secrecy ruled with an iron grip. The deeper the investigation delved, the more it seemed that Richard and Margaret had not just been victims of circumstance, but pawns in a much larger, far-reaching game, one whose players were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their secrets and preserve their power. Every step forward in the investigation seemed to raise more questions than it answered, each new revelation pulling the story into darker, more dangerous territory. But even as the truth remained elusive, the case itself began to cast a long shadow over the people who had once been closest to the Adlers, and it became clear that some stories, especially those tied to wealth and power, are never fully resolved. Despite the relentless efforts of investigators, the case continued to haunt those who had known Richard and Margaret, their family, their friends, their colleagues. Each of them clung to the hope that the mystery would one day be solved, that the truth would finally be brought to light. But the more that was uncovered, the more it became apparent that the truth was not just buried, it was being deliberately hidden. Powerful figures had a vested interest in ensuring that the full scope of the Adlers' involvement in the larger conspiracy never came to light, and every time a breakthrough was made, there seemed to be forces working in the shadows to steer the investigation off course. There were moments of progress, certainly, small victories in the form of new evidence, the occasional anonymous tip, or a breakthrough from a former associate, but these moments were often followed by long stretches of silence, where the trail would grow cold once more. The Adler's disappearance had been a shocking event, but it was the revelations that followed that truly shattered the illusion of normalcy. The deeper the investigators dug into Richard's business dealings, the more they uncovered about the hidden forces that had controlled his life, and by extension, Margaret's as well. They had been involved in much more than a series of financial missteps. They had unwittingly become entangled in a dangerous web of political maneuvering, covert operations, and high-stakes international trade. The money laundering scheme was just one facet of a larger, more insidious conspiracy, and it became increasingly clear that Richard and Margaret had been caught in the crossfire of powerful forces who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to be removed. One of the most chilling discoveries in the case came when investigators uncovered a series of encrypted messages between Richard and an unknown individual. Messages that had been carefully hidden in the deepest recesses of his company's servers. The messages, written in a cryptic code, were initially incomprehensible, but over time, forensic experts were able to decipher them. What they uncovered was both shocking and haunting. Richard had been in direct communication with someone high up in the political and financial world, someone with connections to the very people who had been threatening him. This individual, who was never named outright in the messages, had been warning Richard about the growing danger he faced and had offered him a way out, a way to escape the situation he had found himself in. But the messages were not just warnings. They were also filled with ominous predictions of what would happen if Richard continued to dig too deep, if he refused to back away from the dangerous territory he had inadvertently stumbled into. It was clear that this unknown figure had been trying to steer Richard towards safety, but the more Richard pushed, the more it seemed like there was no escaping the web he had become caught in. The messages also hinted at something far more disturbing, that Margaret had been an unwitting participant in the scheme, that she had been drawn into a world she didn't fully understand. There was no indication that she had been aware of the full extent of Richard's dealings, but the evidence suggested that her life, too, had been manipulated by those who had orchestrated Richard's downfall. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that Margaret had not simply been a passive bystander in this story. She had been a victim as well, caught in a web of secrets and lies that had been spun long before her disappearance. The case took another unexpected turn when a former business partner of Richard's, a man named Daniel Hayes, came forward with new information. Hayes had worked with Richard for several years before the Adler's disappearance, and although their business relationship had soured, he was still deeply affected by the events that had unfolded. Hayes had remained silent for years, not wanting to involve himself in the investigation. But as the years passed and the case lingered, he began to feel a sense of guilt and responsibility. In the years leading up to their disappearance, Hayes had witnessed Richard's increasing anxiety and paranoia. But it wasn't until after the Adlers vanished that Hayes realized just how far Richard had fallen into the clutches of conspiracy. Hayes revealed that Richard had begun acting strangely in the months before his disappearance, constantly on edge, fearful of people he once trusted, and increasingly secretive about his dealings. Richard had confided in Hayes about some of his fears, including his growing suspicions that someone close to him was involved in the money laundering operation, though he never mentioned who. Hayes suspected that Richard had been pushed to the brink by the knowledge he had uncovered, but he also suspected that someone in Richard's inner circle had played a role in his eventual disappearance. Hayes's revelations provided new insight into the Adler's final days, but they also cast a shadow of doubt over the investigation. Had Richard's own associates played a role in his disappearance? Or had he truly been the victim of outside forces, people who had manipulated him, used him, and ultimately eliminated him when he became a liability? The more Hayes spoke, the more it became apparent that Richard had been trapped in a situation where every decision he made seemed to lead him further down a dark and dangerous path. As the investigation into the Adler's disappearance continued to unfold, the authorities began to realize that the case was not simply about finding the missing couple. It was about unraveling the threads of a much larger conspiracy, one that reached into the highest echelons of power and influence. Richard and Margaret had been the unfortunate victims of a game they never understood, their lives collateral damage, in a fight for control and influence that stretched across borders and continents. The deeper the investigation dug, the more the investigators uncovered about the people behind conspiracy. Figures who were skilled at operating in the shadows, at pulling the strings of the global financial system, and at controlling narratives that others never even realized they were part of. Despite the mounting evidence and the increasing sense of urgency surrounding the case, the investigation continued to face significant obstacles. Powerful forces worked to suppress information, to silence those who knew too much, and to keep the truth hidden. Every breakthrough seemed to be met with new layers of obfuscation, as if the forces behind conspiracy were determined to bury the Adler's story forever. And yet, for those who had been closest to Richard and Margaret, the need for answers remained paramount. The case had gone on too long, and too many lives had been touched by the ripple effects of their disappearance. It wasn't just about finding closure for the Adler's family. It was about exposing a network of corruption and greed that had claimed two innocent lives and left a trail of devastation in its wake. In the end, The Adler story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of ambition, the price of success, and the darkness that often lies beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. The case was never truly solved, not in the way that anyone had hoped, but it was a story that would continue to haunt those who had followed it. Richard and Margaret had vanished from the world, but their legacy remained tangled in a web of secrets, lies, and unanswered questions. As the years passed, the mystery of their disappearance became less about the Adlers themselves and more about the system that had consumed them. The truth, it seemed, was always just out of reach, a haunting specter that lingered in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it might finally be revealed, if only for a brief moment before the darkness closed in once again.